Welcome to the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding Civil Rights Leaders Conversation Series. We are so honored and privileged to have with us the President and CEO of the NAACP, Derrick Johnson, who is guiding the organization through a period of re-envisioning and reinvigoration. Our topic today is the role of the Jewish community in combating racial injustice and racial inequality. During the civil rights struggle, there was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to Dr. King and to the African American community as did the Jewish community. The American Jewish community, we understand that a people who fight for their own rights are only as honorable as when they fight for the rights of all people. And we stand in solidarity with the African American community to address the systemic occurrence of racism, racial inequality, racial injustice in our society. So I'd like to ask the first question, Derrick. Why did it take the senseless and brutal killing of George Floyd to mobilize and galvanize the African American community and men and women from all walks of life across America? After all, there have been countless others who have been brutalized by such racial injustice and racial hatred. What was it about this brutal and senseless killing that has brought about the tremendous response that we see in America and around the world today?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. In my opinion, I think what we're witnessing is the culmination of 3.5 years of racial division and the wrong messaging coming from policymakers across the country. We find ourselves in this nation of more racial hatred and messaging that we've seen in a very long time. For African Americans, we've responded, Trayvon Martin, Ferguson, on multiple occasions. But for the rest of America to witness a person being murdered in the street, broad daylight, with officers' knee on a man's neck who was both handcuffed, not resisting, and laying on his stomach, with witnesses saying that he cannot breathe, him saying he cannot breathe, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I think the gruesome nature and the visual reality of what has been taking place for far too long really settled in for many people outside the African American community.
Thank you. As you are aware, that Blacks and American Jews together founded the NAACP in 1909, and as a result, there's been a long-standing partnership between American Jews and the NAACP. As the president and CEO of our nation's oldest and largest civil rights organization, what role can the Jewish community play today in solidarity with the African American community? What does the African American community expect from the Jewish community at this time? And how can the Jewish community further demonstrate its support?
So the NAACP at its founding was a result of a climate in this nation where the social construct we know as race was not inclusive of the Jewish community. They were not considered white, as you well know. For African Americans, we had come through a journey of taking up arms and reinforcing Union troops to save the Unions against a treasonous army, the Confederacy. But W.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter decided to have a meeting in Niagara. And they pulled together some of the intellectual giants of African Americans during the time to talk about how to address the question of race. The following year, there was a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, and there were a set of whites and Jewish who decided that, you know, in order for us to have a true democracy, we cannot stand idly by and have this level of race riots and lynching in broad daylight. and particularly for the Jewish community. They were also being persecuted in certain parts of this nation as well, for their belief and for practicing their culture in ways in which was outside of what was considered the norm. And understanding that the social construct of race, the definition of being white only applied for those who were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So if you was Jewish or Irish, and many other ethnic groups today who are now considered white, were not considered white in 1909. And as a result of that race riots, a group of whites asked the group of blacks who were already formed if they would be for a meeting in New York. And it's out of that meeting that the NAACP was formed to take on an advocacy campaign for anti-lynching, because at that moment, the federal government lacked the power or the authority to go into local jurisdictions and prosecute, investigate, and hold people accountable for the violent acts they were committing on African Americans in broad daylight. And in many Jewish communities, particularly in the areas where immigrant Jews moved here, they were also subjected to violence and forced to live in ghetto-like existence. And I think in 1909, it was truly a common cause. But as you progress in history, it could be our community today, it could be your community tomorrow, it could be another community after that. I think standing in solidarity for humanity, for decency, for equal protection under law is an obligation that we are all bound to live for. But NAACP just recently, we won the Supreme Court decision as it relates to DACA. And many people ask, why would you file that lawsuit? That's primarily immigrants from Latin American countries. Those are the Mexicans or Latinos. And we're very clear, if we don't stand up for those who lack voice, when we lack voice, no one will stand up for us. And I think it's the common bond of humanity that we should all be striving to make sure we participate in.
Thank you. As we're aware, COVID-19 has taken a disproportionate toll on the Black and brown communities here in our country. And consequently, the NAACP launched the We Are Done Dying campaign, aimed at exposing inequities embedded into the American healthcare system and this country at large. What steps are needed to protect the health of Black and brown communities in our nation?
You know, the virus of COVID-19 truly lack any discriminatory intent. It's a virus. It's spread where opportunity presents itself. And when you create an opportunity in communities where there's a lacking of quality food so one can build up an immune system, lacking of access to healthcare, so basic ailments that many communities face go untreated for years. The quality of the environment, air, water is lacking. Many of those things are structural, it's policy driven, and in many ways it's intentional. We're Done Dying is a campaign we're launching to no longer talk about the outcome of the structural racism that exists, but begin to talk about the policies that need to be put in place so all communities will have an opportunity to live in a healthy environment, have access to quality food. But moreover to that, you have a scenario where what we now are calling essential workers, African Americans make a large percentage of that of the workforce. And so where many of us had the privilege to social distance, to telework, there's so many families and individuals who had to go to work every day to keep society moving, whether it's in the Northeast, particularly New York, with mass transit workers, individuals who work in the hospitals, the orderlies and others. It's important for us to stand up in a level of political and policy responsibility to care for all of society, not only those who are privileged.
So the history of African Americans and Jews, what I refer to as the historic Black-Jewish alliance, is a paradigm for other faith communities. In what way do you believe interfaith leaders can advance today civil rights as a means of inspiring needed change and healing today?
You know, many of the holy books, it speaks to the nature of caring for neighbor, supporting neighbor, being a neighbor to your neighbor. And I think there are some very clear shared histories that African Americans in the Jewish community share. There's also some shared experiences and some legacies where we were target communities. And understanding that, you know, I live in Mississippi. I really appreciate the history lessons I've received here, growing up in the North and moving here, particularly around the civil rights movement and understanding the perspective of both leaders in the Black community and leaders in the Jewish community who truly risked their lives to participate to build a more just society. And as I listened to them talk about the why, many of them were growing up and they either lived or witnessed the injustices. They heard the stories and they decided that it was time for them to do something. And in doing something, they found each other. For many of the African American youth activists of the time, they witnessed the funeral of Emmett Till, and they were of that same age. For many Jewish young people at that time, they heard of the atrocities that took place in Germany, and they decided to do something about it after parents and grandparents talked about the courageous nature of escaping. And I think there was a sense of obligation of those young people to realize that if not them, who else would stand up and add their voice to create a just society?
Derrick, before I get to my final question, I just want to pick up on a thought you shared about love thy neighbor. I take it one step further. It's interesting, love thy neighbor is only mentioned twice in the Bible. So love the stranger is mentioned 36 times.
Yes.
And truthfully, the neighbor tends to be someone who is of your race, your ethnicity. Your children may attend the same school, you may attend the same church or synagogue or mosque. I believe the great challenge in the 21st century is to love the stranger, to try and find that commonality that even, you know, particularly as Jews and Christians and Muslims, that not only do we share a common faith, but we share a common fate, and how our single destiny must strengthen our bonds of concern, compassion, caring for each other. So with your blessing, I'm going to elevate the love thy neighbor to include love the stranger, which interestingly enough is mentioned not twice, but 36 times in the Bible. So I want to thank you for affording me to add that insight to your brilliant observation. So my final question to you, that anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is on the rise in 2020. And even some of the recent protests and riots took an ugly turn in LA, where synagogues and Jewish shops were targeted and defaced. What words of solidarity can you offer to the Jewish community in light of these recent incidents?
You know, when you look at the current landscape, it has been socially acceptable to peddle the narrative of white supremacy, racial hatred, and anti-Semitic behavior. Jonathan Greenblatt and I, we're joining forces, NAACP and ADL, to address the spread of hate speech and language so that it's no longer acceptable. And the target we're taking on is Facebook, because it is one of the vehicles that allow that type of message to be carried. To be very clear, many of the protests across the country were very peaceful. And you've seen the faces of America. You've seen young and old and Black and white, male, female, and many faith believers across the faith reality. But we also know people embedded themselves inside the crowd to create distractions, to try to incite violence, to try to promote a message that's not consistent with the need for peaceful protest in the view of unjust laws. And so it is important for us to make sure we focus on peaceful protests to object to laws that are not just, while at the exact same time, whenever possible, identify and remove from among the demonstrators, the peaceful demonstrators, those who are seeking to incite violence or distract from the main narrative. For the NAACP, we took on an aggressive measure to make sure we had marshals and people who can train during the march. So when they identify individuals who try to carry a message other than the message that this country needed at this moment, to have them removed from the march or isolate them so that they can be identified for what they were trying to do. And I think that's really important for us to do. So you don't allow people to embed a negative message in otherwise a very positive, peaceful demonstration.
So Derrick Johnson, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are the beneficiaries of your leadership, wisdom, and guidance. And let me express my heartfelt gratitude for your leadership and your commitment in keeping aglow that light of understanding and caring that truly enables us to see one another, that takes us from the step of love thy neighbor to love the stranger in our midst. And the Jewish community, I know, joins me in pledging our continued commitment and solidarity, particularly with the NAACP and with the African American community as a whole. Thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to reading more about the Loving Thy Stranger. That's a powerful message, so thank you for sharing.
Thank you, my friend. All the best.
Take care.